Hey, everybody, and welcome back to Front Page Fitness with me, Eric Trexler, and the good Dr. Lauren Colenso-Semple. It is now episode 4 already, Lauren. Where has the time gone? We are off to a smashing start. We have severely offended the good people of Canada, which is mostly your fault since you are there and you are officially our delegate to Canada. So that's one problem. Those are some headwinds that we're facing. On the bright side, people really loved your undercover cop, completely generic black baseball cap. So it's been a mixed bag of feedback, some positive, some extremely negative. Folks, if you feel more on the positive side, I'd like to encourage you to like, rate, subscribe, and review, preferably. Usually rating systems on different websites will have a star system. Usually you want to put as many as you can. You basically want to go for the high score as a reviewer, and that kind of reflects favorably on you and also on us. So everybody wins in that scenario. So Lauren, how are you feeling about the feedback so far?
Yeah, definitely not taking any of the blame for the offensive remarks about Canada. As a temporary resident visa holder visitor,
Yeah.
we want to tread lightly here. And so I think you do need to apologize and also acknowledge that Canadian universities exist and are good.
I will meet you a quarter of the way, and I will acknowledge that while in my personal accreditation system, I do not currently acknowledge Canadian universities, there are other accreditation systems, and some of them indeed do acknowledge Canadian universities. Does that sound fair?
Gotcha. Right. We can, dive deep into your personal accreditation system another time, I'm sure.
Yeah, there's a lot to it. There's a lot going on, a pretty big rubric that I keep up to date. So we'll talk about that later. But Lauren, there are so many headlines to dig into, and some of them actually relate to topics we've already talked about in the very short run of Front Page Fitness. So I was looking at some of the headlines that you aggregate. And this one, I mean, what a headline you've put together here. This TikToker snacks on sticks of butter, hasn't eaten a fruit or vegetable in 6 years, and poops once per week. And I see that you linked to a video of this individual's TikTok page. And what would a person see if they viewed that video?
They would see an individual literally chomping on sticks of butter straight and living her best life and being very lean and happy.
Yeah. Please remind me to come back to exactly what you just said in a few minutes, the very lean but happy part, because that is something I have a lot to say about in this episode. So clearly, this individual was not all that compelled by Florida Man with his cholesterol hands. They did not find that to be a particularly jarring cautionary tale. In their defense, maybe it wasn't the sticks of butter. Correlation is not causation, Lauren. So for all we know, it could have been the 6 pounds a day of Cheez Whiz or fondue cheese, depending on where you fall on that controversy. So it's difficult to nail down exactly what was, really pushing a lot of that cholesterol into, or I should say out of this individual's body via these nodules on their hands. But we will see if this individual, aside from pooping once per week, is, I don't want to get all, graphic and disgusting on this show. I don't think anyone wants that, but folks, it's supposed to be more than that. It really is. And I don't know if this is like the hustle and grind entrepreneur culture of think of all the time you could save if you only pooped once a week. You could start a whole other side hustle, maybe purchase a rental property and manage it in the time that you've saved by simply not defecating. But something tells me, from what I know about gastrointestinal physiology, Lauren, I don't think that's just free time. I think that there will be something on the back end that probably makes this not a smart trade if you're just talking about total time. This is generally not a healthy thing to be doing, is what I'm getting at.
Yeah, I think you don't need to be an expert on gastrointestinal physiology to come to that conclusion. Once a week, that's low. It's a low frequency.
Yeah, you don't necessarily want to set the high score, but you want to be in the middle.
Somewhere in the
Yeah, you just want to be right in, yeah, you want to be in the middle of the pack. Now, Lauren, there's another one here: the extreme unapologetic diet of Vietnamese sports legends. So what's going on in this headline? So we're talking about clearly multiple legends. What is the story here?
Yeah, so this sort of goes back to our 30 eggs a day challenge. One of these individuals, very muscular, very successful, he was eating 20 eggs a day. So maybe there's something to it when it comes to muscularity. What do you think?
What a cowardly thing to do. You either do 30 or you don't do it at all, in my book. So
Yeah.
20, I find really disappointing. Maybe it's just because of the eggs market, with the soaring prices and global shortages. So who knows? But
And Easter definitely interfered.
yes, that is true. And that does remind me, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. Do we have any clarification about the relationship between 30 eggs a day guy and the significant other who abandoned him in his time of need due to flatulence? Did we get any updates on what was really happening there?
So they've yet to email us at frontpagefitnesspodcast@gmail.com, but jury's still out. I really question the status of the relationship. I'm really anxious for an update. So if anybody out there knows, please
Have
do let us know.
you personally seen them together in public?
I haven't. So,
Hmm.
I mean, huge red flag. Huge.
That is, yeah, I would definitely. There's a lot of questions there. So we will keep everybody informed. That's what we're supposed to do here, given our news theme of this show. But for now, we'll have to just leave it at that. So clearly, this is going to be tough for us, Lauren, because it's going to be health. It's going to be fitness. We don't want to just play one note. We don't want to come and play the single hit every single episode. But something tells me in this high protein, high fat, low carbohydrate world, there is going to be no shortage of iterative stories. So we have to be very mindful of making sure that each one provides some level of nuance or a new wrinkle or simply just a more humorous angle at what is happening in this world. And I do want to be clear, Lauren. Lauren, you were at the Sports Nutrition Association conference. We both presented there. That was just a couple weeks ago. Presented with the whole MASS crew, the whole MASS Research Review team. And Cliff was there. And Cliff gave a really good talk about low carb dieting, right? And in some instances, I think Cliff is not shy to go pretty low with carbohydrate, depending on the circumstances of the individual. So I don't want it to be like we're just taking pot shots at low carb dieting broadly. There are definitely certainly medical scenarios where low carb dieting is actually the gold standard choice for medical nutrition therapy. It doesn't affect a huge percentage of the population, but it does exist. And there are also ways that you could formulate a really well-crafted, balanced, low carb, and even very, very low carb diet. So I just want to be clear about that. It's going to look very biased when you don't really talk very often about what you eat. You basically just eat seaweed and red wine, which is not what I'd recommend to anybody. But, I've been pretty open over the years about being vegetarian, which tends to go hand in hand with being pretty higher on the carb scale, lower on the fat scale. So I want to get out ahead of people accusing us of severe bias, mostly me, and just say, hey, there's nothing wrong with super low carb dieting, high fat dieting, but you generally don't want your cholesterol above 1,000. You definitely don't want your cholesterol escaping your body physically. And, 30 eggs a day, probably a bit much. Eating sticks of butter as if they were a Snickers bar, also probably a bit much.
And just kind of gross sounding, but to each their
Yeah.
own.
Yeah, exactly. Now, Lauren, there is a news story, a new controversy that we have to cover here, which actually keeps us in the world of super low carb, high fat dieting. And then we're going to move on to bigger and better things. But I wanted to just acknowledge what is, as a researcher, a completely absurd back and forth about a paper recently. So, Lauren, I believe you mentioned that you've at least seen some of the buzz about this on social media. There's a paper published called Plaque Begets Plaque. ApoB does not. Longitudinal data from the keto CTA trial. And this was by Adrian Soto Mota and colleagues. If you're watching on YouTube, I'm battling clearly a severe eye allergy that just popped up in the last 30 seconds. So bear with me here. I'm soldiering through, but in severe pain, Lauren, severe discomfort. But anyway, this paper was published, and basically there's this keto-oriented study, I believe observational in nature in terms of this particular analysis. But what they were looking at was 100 people for this analysis that they consider, I think they consider all these individuals lean mass hyperresponders, which is a term that honestly makes no sense to me. Lauren, does that make any sense at all to you?
No, I mean, we've used the term high and low responders to resistance training in some other contexts, but in the context of this particular paper, it perplexes me.
Yeah, so if you tell me someone's a lean mass hyperresponder, I'm going to assume that what that means is if they just touch a weight, they add a ton of muscle. Like, to me, that's what a lean mass hyperresponder sounds like. In this case, they're talking about individuals who are lean in terms of having low body fat, low-ish body fat. They have very high LDL cholesterol, high HDL cholesterol, and low triglycerides. To me, that doesn't connote anything in the neighborhood of lean mass hyperresponder, but that's often what they call it. And there's kind of this theory that this group often puts forward, which is that these lean mass hyperresponders, these individuals who are kind of lean and they have super high LDL, but their HDL is high, which historically has been called the good cholesterol, and they have super low triglycerides, they've kind of put forth this idea that maybe these folks don't need to be super worried about the fact that their LDL, their kind of bad cholesterol, is really high, because there's something valuable or protective about the fact that they all, in the context of having this high LDL, they're being somewhat protected by having low body fat, high HDL, and low triglycerides. And so basically, with this paper, what they did was they basically, what's the term? They pre-registered it. So before they published the paper, they put out this pre-registration document saying, here are the here's our primary outcome. Here are the main analyses that we're going to do. Basically, we're going to call our shot so that everything's above board. And when we go to publish this paper, people won't think, oh, you collected a bunch of data, you looked around, you decided to, what if we did that as a percentage instead of raw values because it just kind of looks better and fits the narrative better. Let's not report this, but let's report this other stuff that we never actually thought of previously. The whole idea with pre-registering is that there should be no surprises about what shows up in the paper and what is framed as really being front and center in that paper. It's calling your shot, and then you basically have to just report as is and say, well, here's what we thought we'd get, here's what we got. Oops, looks like we were wrong. So the reason this paper caused a lot of buzz, first of all, there's a lot of weirdness in it kind of like leaking, which I'm not pathologically or chronically online, so I didn't really get to the bottom of all that. But I did see a very strange interview where one of the authors is basically like, oh, yes, I never approved this paper at any form, at any stage of the process. And it's like, dude, you're like the senior author on the paper, and I'm looking at a completely formatted version of it at a journal, which means it got submitted to this journal. And on this journal's website, it says very clearly, if you submit this, you are certifying that every author approved this in its current form. So there's all this weirdness about, like, was there a mix-up? Did some of the authors not even approve of the submission? Did they not know what occurred? Do they object to the fact that this was submitted in its current? It was super unclear. There was a lot of just chaos and controversy surrounding it. The type of chaos that only someone who publishes scientific papers would see as being completely irrational and atypical. But trust me, it was very, very strange, the discourse surrounding this paper. But one of the reasons I bring up the whole thing about pre-registration is the primary outcome. And in papers like this, you're going to find people report a zillion different outcomes. The primary outcome is fundamentally not published in the paper. And And they kind of quibble, I think, their justification as well. We published the individual values rather than the percent change values and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, they said, here's our primary outcome. Here's how we're going to quantify it. Here's how we're going to frame it. And that did not exist in the paper. And if you go to their conclusions had nothing to do with that primary outcome, in my interpretation. So their conclusion was, in lean, metabolically healthy people on a ketogenic diet, neither total exposure nor changes in baseline levels of ApoB and LDL cholesterol were associated with changes in plaque. Conversely, baseline plaque was associated with plaque progression, supporting the notion that in this population, plaque begets plaque, but ApoB does not. So they're basically challenging this idea that having elevations in LDL, which contains ApoB, this is kind of the standard belief when it comes to atherosclerosis and heart disease progression, is that if you have high LDL, which tends to mean you have high ApoB levels, that will fuel the progression, all this plaque accumulating in your arteries that will impact arterial function and lead to the progression of heart disease. So in this case, they're like, yeah, forget that whole primary outcome. Let's talk about this. And a really, really good preprint just came out. It was a response to this paper led by Richard Kirwan and a whole bunch of people we know. Spencer Nadolsky's the senior author or last author. I don't know the dynamics of the group. Alan Flanagan is on there, who is like my go-to person when it comes to blood lipids and dietary impacts or dietary factors that impact them. But basically, they really tore this thing apart. And kind of the reason I wanted to bring this up is you are going to go on the internet right now and see a lot of chatter about this paper. And I've seen a lot of places that have covered it totally uncritically. They've said, hey, everything that you thought you knew about heart disease apparently is wrong because of this study. If you have super high LDL, don't worry about it. There's all sorts of crazy stuff. Who could possibly know what fuels the progression of heart disease? But based on this paper, we don't think it's LDL or ApoB. So keep doing your thing. It doesn't matter if your total cholesterol is at 1,000. Just keep on trucking. And basically, the paper that calls them out, I think one of the most important points to raise here. Well, there's two super critical points. So I mentioned in this paper that they were looking at 100 individuals who were all within this kind of situation of having high LDL. And so when they find that LDL changes or LDL levels don't correlate with plaque progression, well, no one is in a good spot here. So it's like you have to have a mixture of low, moderate, and high levels of LDL to actually find if LDL level is going to correlate with plaque progression. In this case, it was just everybody has super high LDL. So of course, it's not going to be a type of data set that lends itself to observing that kind of relationship and correlation. The other thing that is super important here that is pointed out in the this pre-printed kind of response letter is the average change in terms of just like plaque accumulation was really, really high. So the way they put it was that the increase in the non-calcified plaque volume exceeds by 3.8-fold the median annualized progression rate in healthy individuals. So basically what was happening in this paper is everybody was having very accelerated progression of plaque formation in their arteries. And LDL didn't correlate with that because everybody is screwed. This is not good for anyone in the paper. Everyone has extremely elevated LDL, and they are accumulating plaque in their arteries at a rate that is absolutely not good when you compare it to healthy cohorts. So, Lauren, do you have any thoughts on this paper, or is it sufficient to just say, folks, please look at these headlines that are uncritically discussing it, file them away in the don't care, this is nonsense drawer, and continue to apply best practices when it comes to your diet?
Yeah, I don't think there's anything about this particular paper that should give us reason to adjust what we know, generally speaking, about basic nutrition for healthy individuals.
Yeah. And I think to kind of use an instructive analogy, imagine we were looking at a group of people, and BMIs ranged from 45 to 50 in this group of 100 people. Okay. And, overweight begins at 25, obesity class 1 begins at 30, obesity class 2 begins at 35. So we're talking about way out in the range of, advanced obesity at 45 to 50. And we said, well, we want to find a correlation to see, we're going to look at HbA1c, for example, a measure of glycemic control often used to diagnose diabetes. Does BMI correlate with that? Well, if we look at the whole population and there's people with BMIs of 18 and 21 and 27 and 45, then yeah, it will correlate. But if we're looking at a group of people where everyone has a BMI over 45, and we can reasonably infer that the vast majority of these individuals will have diabetes, we will find no correlation, but that does not mean, oh, I guess BMI has nothing to do with it, right? So just really important to keep an eye out when people present some of these oversimplified headlines. I think that's ultimately a big reason why we wanted to do this podcast in general. Is I've seen so many headlines in the last week that have given genuinely dangerous advice about, like, if your doctor says, hey, your LDL is, at 350, oh, just ignore them. Don't worry about it. Well, folks, I hate to say it, but this idea of being a lean mass hyper-responder, aside from the fact that it is a tragically dumb name, and I will stake my whole reputation on forever misunderstanding why they would call it that. But folks, it is not as good as it sounds. And in this particular paper, the rate of plaque progression was really concerning, and it is not good to have super elevated LDL for extended periods of time. All right, Lauren, now we have another little mini story, and then we got our big story for the day. So the little mini story, you put it in here, and the only headline you provided, I don't know how serious you're being here. I don't know if this represents your personal beliefs, but it just says raw milk is better.
There's a lot of chatter around this. Gwyneth Paltrow, who is a famous lady, famous actress, famous entrepreneur, owner of Goop, is a huge proponent of raw milk. Others have followed suit, and there's some controversy here because people push back and say, hey, actually, consuming raw milk is pretty dangerous, and there aren't any additional benefits that you would get from raw milk, even if it were just as safe as consuming the milk most people drink.
Have you ever had raw milk?
I have not.
Okay. Well, don't knock it till you try it, as I always say.
Right.
Yeah. So what are the purported benefits of raw milk? What are people sinking their teeth into when they go to bat for raw milk being superior?
I think this comes down to the idea that anything that is over processed is bad. And so it's really leaning into this moment we're having about, ultra processed foods being really terrible and needing to remove food dyes and preservatives and things that some folks would say are really promoting obesity and poor health in the population.
Yeah. And, despite the fact that I'm a salt of the earth, Midwestern American guy, I have never worked in a dairy farm, which surprises a lot of people. A lot of people think if you grew up in the Midwest, you did spend significant time working a dairy farm. I did not. And so, Lauren, if you could give kind of a 2-sentence explanation of pasteurization. Basically, my understanding is heat is involved, and the whole idea is to kill bacteria and make it more, safe and shelf stable. Is that correct?
That's right. And that's something we've been doing for a really long time, and something that is pretty well established for food safety.
Yeah. So pasteurization is a food preservation process that involves heating liquids or foods to specific temperatures for a set period of time, followed by rapid cooling to kill harmful pathogens and extend shelf life. So, hey, I think I did pretty good, Lauren. Maybe just by osmosis that rubbed off. I do remember, now that I think of it, when I was a child in elementary school, we went on a field trip and I did milk a cow. So maybe it was buried in my subconscious from when I was a child.
I don't
But
think you pasteurized the milk, but
I did not. But I'm sure that they worked it in. Yeah, you got the elementary school kids, you talk about it. That's what I would do as an instructor.
mm,
But yeah, I mean, when you hear that as a process, it certainly is a bit it's a bit odd that it gets wrapped into these discussions about like, well, you're taking out all the good stuff or you're adding in all these crazy preservatives and dyes. And I don't think anyone believes that there's like literally dyes going into their milk because it's white and that's kind of the way it comes out. But yeah, there is this kind of general vague distrust as if it is, yeah, like you said, an extension of this like ultra processed food transition in our food supply. And if you just kind of sit down and talk through it, it's like, well, hey, if we heat this stuff hot enough to kill the pathogens in it, it's going to create something that's less likely to get you sick, more likely to, you know, be stable as it sits on the refrigerated shelf, and you can come by it and drink it, and everything will be great. There's just not really a lot of downsides here. And I mean, think about Louis Pasteur. He worked so hard on coming up with this whole process, named it after himself. He was so proud of it. And here we are, throwing it all away. And for what, Lauren? For what, I ask you?
yeah, I mean, I think that it speaks to a problem generally with what is science communication that's kind of confounded with pop culture. So you have somebody with a really large platform, a big audience, sort of saying, hey, this is going to decrease the risk of illness, or this is going to decrease the risk of allergies, and therefore, we should be consuming it in its more natural form, quote unquote. But really, when it comes to food safety and really the majority of the food that we purchase in the grocery store, there are certain steps that are taken in order for those to survive on a shelf longer than an hour and for us to be able to consume them safely. And the reality is, the downsides of those systems not being in place are tremendous. And we would see so much foodborne illness. So these types of claims are really overhyped and potentially misleading and harmful.
Yeah. The only upside, Lauren, the only upside of contracting foodborne illness is if you happen to be defecating only once a week, that will change. I promise you that will change. But other than that, it's all downside. So I know it's a very it's almost like a very romantic idea. This idea of like, let's go back to our homesteading past where everything was so simple and clean and natural and we didn't have to worry about all that crap and we just did we lived off the land as it was. Like I get the appeal of that. But there's some stuff that's just good. Like I'm not going to try to tell you that you should be like eating Cheetos because they're there. But when it comes to pasteurization, like it really is all upside. And like you said, I think this is kind of a big science communication failure. And I hate to do it, Lauren, but I am going to cause more controversy. Louis, this is on you, buddy. Louis died in 1895, which was many years before Instagram was created. And so he literally did nothing to really impress upon the modern world how important this was. He had no social media presence. He had very few followers. And what I've learned being in exercise science all these days is that that's part of the job now, is that you have to not just do good science, but you have to create a digital following. And Louis, I will give you credit for developing the process, but you got to get out there more, buddy.
Yeah, I mean, what a failure.
Yeah. All right, Lauren. I'm going to let you tee this next topic up. It is our kind of biggest topic of the day. I know that you are highly interested in a lot of the articles you've been seeing about it. So I'm just going to hand the microphone over metaphorically, and I'm just along for the ride.
Well, I know you've written and spoken pretty extensively about creatine supplementation over the years. And there's a new study that was published and some headlines basically saying, hey, everything we knew about creatine was crap. It's not worth the hype. Don't bother. And this comes at a really interesting time because what I see online is a lot of promotion of creatine, especially for women, especially for older people, especially for post menopausal women. So it's sort of interesting that we're seeing this headline come out, and there have been kind of different interpretations of the study. But I think what would be pretty valuable is just to understand why these headlines are out there and then do a bit of an overview on creatine. Should everybody be taking it? Is it overhyped? Is it going to change your life? What's the deal?
Yeah, I feel like you're on to something here. The way the inflection that you were using sounds very much like an investigative journalist who very much is on the case. The way you said, why are these articles coming out, or why are these headlines the way they are? So, I'm very curious as to what you think in that regard. But I am an open book. Like you said, I've studied creatine for quite some time. That was the focus of my is what the main focus of my master's thesis research. So you throw a question at me, I'm happy to answer it, but I'm very intrigued at what kind of conspiracy you've uncovered here.
Well, I think you would probably agree that there's a lot of creatine research out there. And that's
Too much, honestly. Like there's almost no topic I would say that about in exercise science, but it did get to the point that when you found yet another paper come out, it was like, oh, you gave 15 men creatine for 12 weeks, or no, actually for like 7 days. Okay, now, let me guess what happened. The same thing as last time. So yeah, it's been done to death for sure in that context.
And I know you wrote a really long article a couple years back and basically said, hey, creatine can improve exercise performance to a small degree, right? It's not a game changer, but it can. And so if we're talking supplements, this is one of the ones that might be worth taking. It's also fairly safe and fairly cheap if you're just getting creatine monohydrate. But I guess to start with this headline, the authors of this paper basically said the benefits have been overestimated in the past. And that is because the previous trials started creatine supplementation and the exercise program at the same time. And so how are you teasing out the effect of the training versus the effect of the creatine? And they said, well, we didn't really see much here because we were allowing I mean, for the listener, typically when you start taking creatine, it takes a bit to actually saturate the muscle. And so some people will try to do this more quickly by quote unquote loading, doing higher doses over a shorter period of time. And others will take lower doses over a longer period of time. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter. You're kind of getting to the same point and when it comes to the saturation. But these authors have said pretty publicly that they think the findings of their paper should change the way we think about creatine supplementation and those effects on training adaptations, which is sort of shaking things up because as we said, there's been a lot of data out there.
Yeah, do you know by chance approximately how many people were in each group in this study?
Uh, the total was 54.
Okay, so approximately half of that we can infer.
We can.
Um, yeah. So first of all, I thought it was really odd. It's coming back to me now. I read this paper a few weeks ago, and I didn't realize people were really sinking their teeth into it and chatting about it on the internet. I've been more withdrawn from the internet than normal lately. But but yeah, so one of the things that surprises me about this is they wanted to assess the effect of creatine, it sounds like over the first week, and then they introduced training on top of it. But to the best of my knowledge, they did not actually do a creatine loading phase, which normally, if you wanted to see what creatine can do and you only had a week to do it, you would give people like 20, 25 grams a day for 7 days. And you should be able to fully saturate muscle creatine levels. But in this case, I think they just gave them like a fairly standard maintenance dose. And after 7 days, they're like, oh, they only gained like half a kilogram or something like that, which is completely in line with what you'd expect. Because, they were uh, probably 20 to 30% of the way to actually obtaining the full benefit of creatine and fully saturating their muscle storage there. So yeah, I mean, I'm a little bit confused that the researchers were surprised by the general lack of benefit of just taking creatine with no lifting at a maintenance dose for like 7 days. So that part surprised me. When it came to, then looking at the lack of an effect over a 12-week program, I'm also a little bit surprised that they are surprised by a null finding, a finding where there's no significant advantage of creatine, because there are literally hundreds of papers that have found no advantage of creatine, no significant advantage of creatine in this very context, in this type of study. So it's not like this is an aberration or something that's not been seen literally hundreds of times. There was a recent meta-analysis that looked at the effect of creatine on, changes in, I think it was fat-free mass, maybe throw some strength metrics in there, etc. But for the fat-free mass, I forget if it was fat-free mass or specifically muscle thickness they were looking at. But in any case, the effect size for creatine supplementation was 0.1 to 0.2, depending on which kind of sub-analysis you're looking at. And basically what that means is, let's say they were looking at fat-free mass in a group of people. You measure the average, or you measure it, then you calculate the average, and you calculate the standard deviation of that average to get you an idea of how much dispersion there is in this data, how much variance or variability. And so creatine would improve or would increase, the amount of fat-free mass by about 0.1 standard deviations above the mean, or in the 0.15-ish range. If you were to go to any other field and say, hey, look, we've got an effect size of 0.15, they would say almost unanimously, who cares? Like, no one cares about that. But in the supplement world, a reliable effect on fat-free mass or muscle thickness or whatever of 0.15 is literally like as good as it gets. And what you have to understand is with some of these small sample studies, if the true average population level effect is an effect size of 0.15, sometimes you're going to do a small study and get an effect size of 0.45. And then sometimes you're going to do it and get an effect size of negative 0.2. Like, you're going to have this spread within the data. So I not only reject the idea that this particular paper, that the findings are out of step with what we could reasonably expect, but I also strongly would fight back against the idea that there is a single creatine study you could do and publish tomorrow, and we would say, well, let's forget everything we thought we knew about it. Because you really have to look at the data in aggregate and figure out, okay, like I said, for a supplement that's been studied in well over 1,000 papers, maybe we should not completely flip the script by paper number 1601.
So what do you think about this new wave of recommendations for women, or particularly for older women? There are a lot of new supplements coming out that basically it is just creatine, but it's being packaged differently. It's pink creatine. And so my concern is that there's an overemphasis on the benefits that people are going to get, because it's, hey, creatine is going to preserve your lean mass as you age, it's going to preserve your bone health, it's going to improve your brain function, all of these types of claims. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I've got a lot of thoughts there. And there's no question. It's going to sound like I'm contradicting myself, but I'm not. Uh, Creatine is in many circles overhyped. So like you can say in the same breath, creatine is as good as it gets for a supplement for many outcomes. And also its effects are very small.
Right.
like, and so I remember when I was in high school, this is when Ronnie Coleman was on all the advertisements for NO Explode. And NO Explode, made by a company called BSN, was like basically the only pre-workout on the market. And that was back when they're still using just like L-arginine. Like citrulline wasn't even around yet. Nitrate wasn't put in these supplements yet. Um, and I remember a kid on my football team got on the stack where he was doing NO Explode before our workouts, and he was doing, I think they called their post-workout creatine containing product. I think they called it Cell Mass or something like that. But anyway, we got wind of it, and it was like a Lifetime movie. You know those like over dramatic, like we were all like, dude, how could you do this? How could you do this to us? And how could you do this to yourself? And how could you do this to the integrity of sport? Like
Mm.
getting on creatine, you're cheating, so many levels here. And in hindsight, just absolutely insane. Like he probably got nothing out of it other than just like a level 10 placebo effect. He probably got a tiny bit out of it, which is exactly what he should have gotten out of it.
And you spend some money, so you have to weigh the cost
Oh
benefit.
God, yeah. Because yeah, those were as if you were trying to get the worst bang for your buck as a creatine user, that is exactly what he would have done. So, but yeah, so it's overhyped in the lifting world for sure in terms of the magnitude of effect. And to the claims that you're referring to, it's severely overhyped. So I'll kind of give my overview thesis, and you can kind of dig deeper into whatever elements you have an interest in. But like, would I suggest you should take creatine if you do not do any kind of resistance training and just say, well, I'm sure the creatine will have a helpful impact on my muscle mass, for example? I wouldn't bother. It is, in my opinion, not going to have a meaningful effect. Spend 0% of your time thinking about creatine in that context, and spend the rest of it thinking about how am I going to find some modality of resistance training that works for me. So I would not take it for muscular effects in the absence of resistance training. When it comes to bone, I'm very much of the opinion, based on the literature I've seen, and I've looked into it, I've looked at meta-analyses, I don't buy the fact that creatine is having an additive effect on bone uh, above and beyond resistance training. So if you're taking creatine in the absence of resistance training and hoping it's going to do something for bone, I think you're out of luck. If you are resistance training already and you're saying, well, I'm going to add in creatine because that's going to help me even more with increasing bone mineral content or bone density or whatever the case may be, I don't think the data really support that. The research looks really underwhelming for that. The one area where I will throw a bone to creatine and acknowledge that I am intrigued is when it comes to the brain. And there's good reason for that. Creatine is an energy supplement. The whole idea of using creatine for muscle, for example, is we're going to increase our muscular storage of creatine, and that's going to help us generate ATP, the kind of cellular energy currency, when we really need it in these really energy intensive situations. So when you're doing high intensity exercise and you need a lot of energy production very rapidly, that's where creatine shines. And the one thing that we rarely think about throughout the day is the fact that our brain is a massive energy suck. Like, our brain is just churning through energy on a regular basis. The brain energy utilization often is estimated as making up about a quarter of our resting metabolic rate, despite the fact that it is a relatively small structure when you scale it relative to the entire body. So the brain is just like a little calorie burning machine, and does run into issues whenever there's a bottleneck related to energy production and energy metabolism. There are For example, there are uh, seizure conditions, epileptic conditions, where if your brain cannot metabolize glucose a certain way, because of that energy shortfall acutely in the brain, you will experience a seizure as kind of an effect of that. So for me, when people talk about creatine's role in the brain, I mean, we know for sure if you were born with a congenital condition that limits your brain's ability to make creatine or to have creatine cross into it via transporters. If you are born with a low level of creatine in your brain, it will have catastrophic effects. It is a very, very catastrophic congenital effect that is observed in some percentage of the population. And you don't have to worry about, do I have that? If you did it, you would know. Like I said, it's an extremely catastrophic thing that's diagnosed very early in life and impacts development in a myriad of ways. So we know that creatine is critically important in the brain. We know that energy production, whenever it's a bottleneck for any process in the brain, we can start to see some effects of that. So I'm generally on board with the idea that creatine can have positive effects in the brain if, big caveat, if we can actually increase brain creatine content via supplementation. I have seen some studies that are really intriguing where creatine supplementation, for example, in conjunction with cognitive behavioral therapy, improves the outcomes of that cognitive behavioral therapy. I've also seen studies where creatine utilization in conjunction with the use of prescribed selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, improves some of the intended outcomes like, depression, anxiety score, depression severity scores and anxiety severity scores. There are also some interesting studies where taking more creatine can facilitate cognitive function, specifically in conditions that are highly stressful to the brain in terms of just being able to function and create enough energy. So things like sleep deprivation, for example. So I'm on board. I've seen enough evidence to convince me that creatine plays an important role in the brain and that creatine supplementation can have these very specific effects on certain elements of brain function in scenarios where brain function is impaired by some kind of stressor. So what I do, an area where I think we need remarkably more, like substantially more creatine research is what kind of dosing do we actually need to make that work? Because I've seen some research where they give people 5 grams a day for an extended period of time, and they really struggle to detect meaningful changes, with kind of modern scanning techniques, meaningful changes in brain creatine content. So I'm of the opinion that creatine actually can have some beneficial effects in some of these unique scenarios, but we probably need to go a little heavier with the dosage to make that happen. And how heavy is heavy enough is a really hard question to answer. And the reason I say that is, for example, I mentioned earlier, Lauren, if you want to maximize muscle creatine levels and you want to do it in 7 days, you take like 20, 25 grams a day. If you were comfortable waiting a month, then you could give like 3 to 5 grams a day. And there's this kind of interesting relationship between the acute dose and the cumulative dose. In some tissues, we can find that kind of much lower dose where if we just do it day after day, enough will accumulate in the tissue that we essentially max out what we're trying to do in that tissue. I don't think we've really determined what that is for the brain yet. So, for example, if we wanted to really make something happen in a short time period and we're going to do creatine supplementation, I'd say we better throw 20, 25 grams a day at it for a few weeks, because it does seem like the brain requires higher dosages to really get saturated or to see some of these meaningful changes in brain creatine content. But in terms of what's a more moderate dose that if you just take it every day with time, it'll saturate and will be good, I don't think we have that number yet, but I'd be really stunned if it was 5 grams like most people take for muscle. I'm very much of the belief it's probably more in the at least 10 to 15 gram a day ballpark.
And if you are going to see an effect in these specific circumstances that you've mentioned, what is the size of that effect? Is it a similarly small effect size as you mentioned with muscle, or are we thinking about something more meaningful potentially?
Well, the problem is, as we kind of joked about, when you want to figure out how creatine affects muscle growth or, changes in fat free mass, we have like a zillion papers, right? So it's easy to throw that into a meta-analysis. Well, it takes a lot of time and effort, but we can put that into a meta-analysis and get a really good estimate of like, what is the real typical effect that we're seeing here? These new frontiers of creatine, we don't have all that much research yet. And the studies we do have, especially with the brain stuff, they are so hard to combine because it's like, oh, we're going to give you guys 10 grams a day for this many weeks, and we're going to study you in the context of sleep deprivation and see how it affects memory and cognition. And for you, we're going to tack this on to your SSRI treatment for your depression scores. And over here, we're going to just like really confuse you and have you do a really mentally demanding task and then test your memory after that. So there's so much disparity in terms of how these studies are designed and what they're actually testing that it's really, really difficult to just say, yeah, let me give you a singular effect size that kind of explains the broad literature. I think the literature where I've seen what seems to be often viewed as a clinically significant benefit is specifically in the realm of depression scores for people who have like diagnosed clinical depression, right? So in that case, it's really important to remember we are addressing something that is already clinically diagnosed as being out of the typical range in terms of depression scales and things like that. So the kind of take home point from my view is we need a lot more research. We should not be expecting like massive game changing effects here, but I do think that there's promise. Another one I didn't even mention is with traumatic brain injury. So and technically concussions, just your run of the mill sport concussions, or those fall under that umbrella of like a mild traumatic brain injury. There's some research to indicate that having been on creatine leading up to that brain injury could facilitate faster recovery and less impairment cognitively. So I'm, as much as I'm like super skeptical about bone, I'm actually really intrigued by what we see about uh, effects of creatine on brain. But to your point, Lauren, or to the point you're leading me toward, I suspect we should expect fairly modest effects. These are not going to be huge game changer effects. These are going to be small things that really make more sense in conjunction with other treatments, right? So, for example, no one in their right mind would say like, oh, you're experiencing symptoms of depression. Have you tried creatine? It's like, no, you should probably, try. Well, I'm not even going to speculate. I'm going to say go to your physician, and they are likely going to tell you, hey, we should talk about maybe some cognitive behavioral therapy or an alternative, version of therapy with a clinician. Maybe we decide that it's warranted to include a pharmacological intervention like an SSRI. There's a lot of different SSRIs that are worth discussing that have their own kind of unique profiles. And then maybe on top of that, you say, you know what, I am, on a vegan or vegetarian diet with like almost no creatine intake, maybe I might consider throwing some creatine in the mix to be more of the icing than the cake in terms of that treatment plan. So yeah, I think we should expect small effects, if any. I think we probably need to take higher doses of creatine in order to really get the needle moving in the brain, especially over short time scales. So it's an area that intrigues me, but where we have a lot of optimism and not a lot of really solidified clinical guidance.
And as we spoke about on the last episode, when we were talking about extrapolating from clinical populations, when it came to cortisol, for example, we want to be a bit careful to say, oh, well, the absence of something is bad, or something in excess is bad, but if you're healthy and those levels are well regulated and that subsequent function is fine, then it doesn't necessarily mean that regulating that externally, in this case with supplementation, would be meaningful. So we need that data in those healthy populations before we would recommend it broadly. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and I think just kind of the like simple summary of that, in my view, is if we're taking creatine for the brain, um, we are trying to rectify something that warrants being rectified. You know what I mean? So, for example, you are sleep deprived, and maybe there's research that creatine can offset some of the negative cognitive effects of that sleep restriction, or you have clinical symptoms of depression. Maybe there is some small added benefit in that context that can help out with some of those symptom scores. But yeah, if you are sleeping like a baby 9 hours a night, and your brain creatine levels are completely in a normal range, and you're not experiencing anything of clinical relevance, or any kind of reductions in cognitive function, memory, all these different parameters of brain health and brain function, we're not going to supercharge our brain, taking it from a normal level to an extra high level. So again, it's just reframing. We're not trying to supercharge the brain. We are trying to identify areas where it's like, oh, this could probably be rectified. And in these select scenarios we've talked about, creatine could play a small role in the process of rectifying that.
You mentioned something about vegan, vegetarian diets in there. Can you just elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, this is tricky. I'm of the belief that we need to do a lot more research, with really good, validated measurement techniques to figure out the effects of dietary creatine intake on brain creatine levels. So we do have adequate evidence at this point. It's a lot easier to measure creatine in muscle. Lauren, you would know, you're one of those butchers that's taken muscle out of people via biopsy. There's a lot of ways we can measure creatine in muscle, and it's a pretty reasonable ask to say, hey, do you mind if I take just a tiny little bit of your quadriceps muscle and just analyze it for creatine? We don't take brain biopsies to figure out how much creatine is in there, right? So we have to use the, really advanced imaging techniques that are really expensive, really sophisticated, fairly novel, relatively speaking, compared to other, like with muscle creatine, we've been able to get great numbers on that for forever. Um, so all that is to say, like, we know that a vegan or a vegetarian who maybe is getting like little to no creatine in their diet, their muscle levels of creatine more often than not are going to be detectably lower than the muscle creatine levels of an omnivore who maybe is eating a bunch of fish and beef and pork and chicken and all this other stuff and seafood, and they are getting more creatine in their diet than the vegetarian or the vegan. So it's a fairly intuitive relationship where we see folks who are eating extremely low creatine diets, which is kind of the default for vegan or vegetarian diets, you're going to have lower muscle creatine levels in the absence of supplementation, most likely. Now, to the extent that that also extends to the brain, there is actually conflicting evidence. But man, I find it to be really intriguing. And this is reckless, Lauren. We should probably just cut my mic off. But when you there have been some studies showing some detectable differences in like depression symptom scores comparing vegetarians and vegans to omnivores. Now we're seeing, okay, well, there's actually like enough data for a meta-analysis looking at creatine as kind of an add-on, kind of additional treatment in combination with cognitive behavioral therapy or SSRIs for depression interventions. It's really hard for me to not kind of look at these different bits of evidence and start kind of I'm fighting the urge to kind of, start tying these different things together and saying this does look like kind of a little constellation of ideas that has some degree of compatibility of vegan and vegetarian diets, perhaps in some cases leading to perhaps, lower brain creatine levels that perhaps may be feeding into some of these elevated depression symptom severities that we see in some of the literature, which apparently, in cases where folks have elevated symptom scores, it looks like creatine can have a slight positive effect. I don't know. This is half baked. Like there's not enough to actually plot out that entire kind of causative chain there. But the thing about, cautiously following and interpreting science is not that you're supposed to just like be drug kicking and screaming to conclusions 10 years after they've been reasonably settled. You know what I mean? Like it's okay, in my opinion, to look around at the data and say, I know that I cannot definitively connect all those little bits of information, but there is a reasonably plausible way that they could be connected in the future, and I'm going to keep my eye on it. Does that make sense? I feel like that's not overstating the strength of the evidence, but all of that is to get back to your original question. It's still an open question about whether or not vegans and vegetarians actually have like meaningfully lower brain creatine levels. So I'm following that very closely. I would not be shocked if we find that that actually is the case. And that is, again, coming from someone who my bias would tell me to say, no, it's vegetarian diet's the best diet ever. And there could never be any kind of, potential downside that you'd want to supplement to rectify. So there's debate about it. We need more imaging studies. They're expensive. They require a lot of technical skill, so they're hard to come by. But it's not a very satisfactory answer. But that's kind of where we're at.
So if I can summarize and correct me if I'm wrong, when it comes to creatine in the brain, there might be something there. It's an area of the literature we should kind of keep an eye on. We need more studies. But for the average person, supplementation is probably not warranted. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, yeah, because I have seen folks who basically, Lauren, I'm sure you've seen them. They basically act like the default human condition is you should supplement with creatine.
Right.
It's like every person should, and I'm not of that opinion. My belief with creatine is if you're resistance training, why not? It's not going to make or break your gains. I wouldn't say like you have to, but like we've already discussed, creatine monohydrate is the best and cheapest form, and it's a beautiful thing when both of those are true at the same time. So creatine monohydrate, 5 grams a day ish, maybe a little more if you have a lot of muscle mass. Is a great idea to just get a little extra boost with your resistance training. If you're into that kind of thing, you'll still go very far without it. Not a big deal if you don't want it. For bones, I don't think about creatine at all. I think it has nothing to do with bones, frankly. For the brain, I would only consider supplementing with creatine if one of these unique scenarios in the literature actually pertained to my situation, right? So, these are, if I was chronically sleep deprived, first of all, might I recommend trying to not be chronically sleep deprived? And that's me being a huge hypocrite because lately I've been sleeping like 5 hours a night, which is not ideal. But if you have a clinical condition where, maybe there's a possibility of creatine having an added benefit, the best case scenario is you just chat with your doctor and say, oh, I heard on the internet that this might be helpful. What do you think? And they should be able to lead you in the right direction because I can't provide you, Lauren, an exhaustive list of all possible brain scenarios because it's not just clinical conditions. It's also like sleep deprivation. I think mental fatigue. I think elevation maybe. So there's all these different scenarios where it's been studied. And so I would only think of creatine as a brain supplement if I really believe that one of those scenarios was pertinent to something I was experiencing and hoping to rectify.
For muscle, bone, brain, or anything else, should we consider sex differences or age differences?
Um, with creatine,
Yes.
not to my knowledge. I can't think of a reason that you would. Have you seen anything to the contrary?
My take is that it's being promoted to older people or post menopause because they're acutely aware that preserving muscle and bone is an issue. And so I don't actually see it as different, but the marketing tactic is such that, hey, we know that you're concerned about muscle and bone. Instead of focusing on the things that are actually important for building and preserving muscle and bone, let's
Yeah.
throw you a supplement.
And I kind of hate this because I do want to acknowledge, like what I talked about with the brain, how I have some optimism, but we definitely need more data. With bone, we actually have a lot of data. Like we kind of, I don't want to overstate the strength of the evidence, but we kind of actually know it doesn't work
Yeah.
for bone. So that's what that kind of grinds my gears a little bit that people are pushing this specifically to like peri and postmenopausal women because it's like you're clearly tapping into a pertinent health concern related to osteoporosis. And it's not just like, hey, it makes sense that this would work and maybe it will. We don't know. We don't have the data. It actually doesn't make sense that it would work. And we do have the data and it doesn't look good.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, especially given that we know exercise recommendations that are good for bone. There are osteoporosis medications that are good for bone. In some cases, hormone therapy might be indicated for bone. So the idea that we're going to disregard all of those and focus on creatine supplementation is not the move.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't say that better myself. And the other things I would add is like if you're thinking, oh, but I heard maintaining muscle is important, the number one thing by far is you got to find a way to do resistance training that works for you, that's safe for you, that's enjoyable for you. A distant second is making sure you're eating enough protein every day. And then a even more distant, way far away third would be throwing in creatine as it pertains to muscle related applications. When it comes to brain related applications, um, in all of these scenarios, it really only makes sense to throw creatine in kind of after you were doing the standard of care for whatever you're trying to address, right? So, like I said, if you have depression or anxiety that's reaching kind of clinical significance where you're like, I need to intervene and treat this, your first step is to go straight to a physician or qualified medical professional who will put you on a treatment plan with much higher odds of success. And whether or not you choose to throw creatine in there is a worthwhile discussion to have with that practitioner. But oh my God, talk about a distant, tertiary kind of add-on treatment. So don't let the marketing confuse you in terms of priority. Like just because creatine may have an application in some of these scenarios, we have to focus on the big picture stuff first. And if we want to sprinkle a little, hopeful supplement on top and say, well, there actually is some science here and we'll see if it works. Great. Talk about it with your doctor and they'll let you know if that's appropriate.
And just to hammer it home once again, there is no specific formulation of creatine supplement that is better for women or better for older people or better point blank than creatine monohydrate.
Well, usually if there's any kind of pink on the label, that would give you an indication it's better for women. And usually if there's some kind of indication of happy people enjoying an independent life, that usually means it's better for older people. I'm kidding, folks. No, the creatine, there is one form of creatine that's ever worth looking into at this point, and it's creatine monohydrate. It's the most studied. It's the cheapest. The one thing I will, a little caveat there, most folks don't do this. Most companies don't do this because it's such a bad idea. But do not buy a form of creatine that is already mixed into a liquid. There was a popular energy a while back that had creatine in it. And a lot of people are like, well, should I take my normal creatine or is this enough? And so creatine will break down pretty rapidly if it's mixed in solution. So you want to have creatine in a powder or capsule form, and you don't mix that powder into liquid until you're about to consume it. Because if you leave it sitting out for a week, a lot of that creatine will degrade and will not actually have the intended effect. It won't be dangerous, but it's just a waste.
Well said. I think this is great because there's, again, a lot of misinformation out there about creatine, a lot of overemphasis on creatine, in my opinion, especially when it comes to the size of the effect or its utility in the absence of exercise.
Yeah, definitely. All right, Lauren, does that wrap it up for tonight?
I think so. But if
All right.
you want to send us a question or a comment, where should they email us?
They should email us at, I've had to do extensive edits on our first few episodes because we cannot get our own email right. But it is at frontpagefitnesspodcast@gmail.com. That is where you can email us. Also, I would say, Lauren, it's totally fine for people to reach out via Instagram as well. Comment on our posts, maybe send a DM here and there, respectfully. If you want, I'm not going to sign you up for that, Lauren, but if people want to reach me, I'm on Instagram at Trexler Fitness. Lauren, if you care to share your contact information, you may. Otherwise, we can blow right by it.
For all compliments and 5-star reviews, that's Dr. Lauren CS1. For anything negative, that's Trexler Fitness.
Yeah, that works for me. I do well with negativity. I thrive in it. Well, folks, thank you so much for enjoying yet another episode of Front Page Fitness. We appreciate you, and we will see you next time.